There's plenty of seats at the front. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And as I explained, Ms. Lamont was delayed slightly by a vote and then by Edinburgh traffic, post-tram traffic that we will be saying soon. I'm very grateful to Johann Lamont for agreeing to undertake this seminar for us. As you'll be aware, this is the second in a series of 5 seminars on issues related to constitutional change. And tonight's seminar is all about the optimism of politics, and I'm very much looking forward to this. Johann Lamont has been Scottish Labour Party leader since 2011, having been before that an activist, an MSP, a committee chair and deputy leader, and actually having spent prior to that 20 years as a teacher in Rothesay, Springburn and Castlemilk. So she's been out there in the real world, unlike some politicians around the place. And she is married with 2 children. Comes from Glasgow, but came from further afield before that, as I think we'll hear shortly. So I'm very grateful to her. She'll be speaking to us for 30, 40 minutes, whatever it is, and then there'll be ample time for your questions, for a question and answer discussion. So I very much ask you to welcome Johann Lamont.
Thank you very much, and again apologise for the delay. A small matter of the budget being decided this afternoon, and yes, the challenge of traffic, which is a burden for all of us. Can I start off perhaps by saying that I bring greetings from my family, actually commiserations from my family. They can't believe that MD's going to have to sit and listen to me for 45 minutes, but they reckon that your suffering at least liberates them a little of the time. I'm not sure anybody can listen to anybody for 45 minutes, but however, I am immensely grateful for the opportunity to come along and share some of my thoughts with you and have the opportunity, I think, probably in question and answer and continuing dialogue to really discuss some of the big challenges, I think, of politics. And the title, The Optimism of Politics, some people may feel that I don't have an optimistic bone in my body, but actually optimism is what drives me, which is perhaps not what is expected, but I do think it is a desire to re-engage with the political debate in a serious way, which I think is critical at this time in Scotland, and I hope I can persuade you of my argument. A few weeks back, one of my predecessors, the former First Minister Jack McConnell, called for both sides of the referendum campaign to down tools for the duration of the Commonwealth Games. And I'm sure that for many people, the idea of a few weeks' respite from the claims and the counterclaims would be pretty welcome. Perhaps the only question would be, can we wait until July for that much-needed break? Because I do think we will need all of the energy that we can draw upon to get through what I think will be a very difficult and a tough period. So yes, I am here to discuss the referendum and Scottish independence, but also, in my view, and I think more importantly, why I believe in the optimism of politics and its ability to bring about change for the better. And as we look ahead to this historic year, the Commonwealth Games is a good place to start, because I hope when people visit Glasgow in the summer, they will see a modern, confident, outward-looking city. I hope they see a Glasgow which has changed for the better. Glasgow won the right to host the Games because long ago, well before the Games were on the horizon, people in Glasgow chose a new future and then planned, prepared and delivered it. Lots of people who had a stake in the city and beyond wanted to change Glasgow, change people's perceptions, change its image and change the lives of the people who lived there. And it was no accident that Glasgow won the right to hold this prestigious event. Now, while we have some way to go, I believe the Commonwealth Games will allow us to showcase just how much Glasgow has changed. Glasgow's story is just one example of change happening all around us. But its message is also that it does not happen by accident. It is by people deciding and acting to make a difference. We have to make things happen. And although I'm immensely proud of my own home city, my own roots are a little further afield. My mother and father were both from crofting families on the island of Tiree. So while I grew up in Glasgow, it was a home where Hebridean culture was very evident, where Gaelic was spoken, where my mother would still refer to the Glasgow people, even though she spent years living amongst them, where we would listen to the wireless, not just to listen to Gaelic programmes, to find out what the weather was like back home. And I always looked forward to my summers in Tiree as a child. And I remember recounting, or perhaps boring, a journalist with my island connections, and he expressed surprise that someone with that kind of background would end up campaigning to save the Union, and thought I would surely be much more likely to be a nationalist, perhaps because living on the islands or remote communities somehow made you more Scottish. It's not an uncommon mistake, I think, but I believe it is that background which formed much of the beliefs I hold close to in politics today. Because it wasn't people coming from over the border who tried to force my forebears and their neighbours off their land. It was fellow Scots. And any reading of history is lacking if it does not recognise some fundamental truths about the causes of discontent, misery and injustice in our past. As a child, I saw inequality played out in my classroom in inner city Glasgow, and in Tiree, I learned of the searing injustice of people without land or rights. And the threat to the culture and the language that was so important to these island communities didn't come simply from England, but it came from all round about where there was no respect for the diversity and different aspects of Scottish culture. Today in 2014, Scotland still has one of the most unequal distributions of land in the world, but at least no one can turf people out of their homes to make way for sheep like they did in the past. Again, that wasn't an injustice which corrected itself. It changed because those people who were victims of this system got together, organised and argued for it to be changed, taking on those who its unfairness suited, and they do so still, with community ownership of the land in Scotland driving a quiet revolution in some of our most fragile communities. Only this weekend, I met with people who are addressing the benign neglect that their community suffered for too long, developing practical measures to ensure that families stay within these communities and actually these communities begin to thrive economically. The struggle to stop exploitation and secure tenure for their families shows how a movement can bring about real change. So my connection to the Hebrides didn't make me a nationalist, far from it. It was what made me a socialist. It taught me that the dividing line in life wasn't at Hadrian's Wall, it was between the haves and have-nots. Geography and identity did not determine those who had power and those who didn't. Just because they were also Scots doesn't mean I hold the same values as a Duke of Argyll or a Patrick Seller. But I do believe I have much in common with mothers, with teachers, with politicians, with progressives all over Britain and beyond. Learning of the struggle of the land leaguers to overcome that inequality was one of the examples that opened my eyes to what politics could achieve. For I learned too that no matter the scale of the challenge or the apparent impossibility of change, it could be done. Optimism in the face of injustice and inequality has driven many movements and created hope for peace, for women's rights, for equality and for justice. Nearly 40 years ago, and I know you'll be surprised to realise it's as long as that, full of optimism, I joined the Labour Party as a young student because I believed politics could change the world and make it fairer and better. In that time, we have made tremendous progress in health, in education, in our economy. Yet I am still angered at the inequality, the injustice and the lack of opportunity that we see every day. But I do remain optimistic that we can change things. When I joined the Labour Party as a 17-year-old, it was because I was amazed by people like Harold Wilson and Shirley Williams taking on those invariably posh Tory ministers and beating them with arguments that I understood and supported. They showed me that politics wasn't just for the very clever, the very powerful, for very rich people who did not understand the lives of me, my family and my neighbours. They showed politics was a battle of ideas, and those were the best ones got to put them in place. It showed me that anyone who believed things could be different and that they were right could use politics to bring about change. I knew that Labour was the party for me, and the more I learned about its history, the more I was sure. Instead of politics being a sport for the few, my Labour Party was about electing politicians, yes, but being part of the thinking and understanding of people's lives which would shape their actions in power. And whether it was the cooperative movement, the tenants movement that wrested housing and housing policy from the centre into communities and transforming them, whether it was people with families or people with learning disabilities who said, we don't want our children, our young people in long-stay hospitals, we believe in their potential, Whatever of these movements, they have shaped the thinking of the modern Labour Party and insisting that that is the politics of today too. Unlike the Conservatives and Liberals, Labour's origins are not found in the parliamentary politics of the 18th century. Labour sprang from a movement early in the last century, a movement of working people committed to fighting injustice wherever it existed. Their aim was to break down the barriers thrown up by an unjust society. They never accepted that this simply could be achieved by erecting a border. They knew this was too simple. Rights have to be fought for at every stage. Labour has always believed that it's through collective endeavour that we can achieve the best for people. For that reason, in the United Kingdom, social provision, pensions, health and welfare services are supported by general taxation, levied and collected across the country according to an ability to pay, not by local resources. This was a cause led by trade unionists and social reformers from across the breadth of Britain who argued for national unemployment assistance. It wasn't identity and geography which allowed the factory owners to exploit the workers, it was power. And the trade union movement shows us how we can change that by empowering those who have no power. And it is why Clement Attlee's Labour government in 1945 created a national health service funded from general taxation rather than a system of local authority hospitals funded by ratepayers and patient fees. The NHS is based on one simple idea. Treatment is determined by clinical need, not the ability to pay, no matter where you live. And that was a principle secured by a Scotsman and a Welshman. It was Tom Johnson, as Secretary of State for Scotland, who refused to accept a system of health provision reliant upon local funding and charging, instead insisting on the nationalisation of the healthcare system. Despite opposition from within the corridors of Whitehall, Johnson thwarted the wartime coalition's government proposals on piecemeal reform because he realised that creating a health system based on local authority finance would never be sufficient in securing free healthcare for people at the point of need. It had to be something bigger. This provided the blueprint of a plan for the Welsh Secretary of State for Health, Nye Bevan, when he established an NHS free at the point of need, funded from general taxation from across the United Kingdom. Now, while everyone now accepts the principle of the NHS and politicians fight to show who cares most about our doctors and our nurses, we should never forget that the NHS wasn't always a universally popular idea and that those who believed in it had to fight and argue for it. And it does give a lie to the idea that Westminster could never and has never driven a radical agenda. And the same is true in education. Before I was elected, as our chair has said, in 1999, I spent 20 years as a teacher, working first in Rothesay and then Springburn and Castlemilk in Glasgow. I saw at first hand the social barriers that young people face, but also saw that learning could help achieve a better life. A commitment to education is a value we hold dear in Scotland and have done for many centuries. But it didn't come about just because we're Scottish. It came about because of a belief in the value of education as a good in itself, and that those who recognised that were prepared to argue for a school in every parish, a radical idea in its time. Scotland was the first nation to aspire to universal elementary education. In 1696, just prior to the Act of Union, the Scottish Parliament passed the School Act, establishing a school in every parish. It made Scotland one of the first societies in which literacy was widespread. Scottish education is based on a powerful unifying ideal that everyone should have the opportunity of a good education, regardless of background. And that is why it's a deeply personal regret to me that the crusade in education in Scotland now is not to tackle the gap in attainment, which matches entirely the gap between rich and poor, but instead we have simple sloganising where action is desperately needed. This emphasis on education created the conditions for the Scottish Enlightenment, which shaped the modern world. The Scottish Enlightenment produced thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith and set the context for later Scottish technological achievements during the Industrial Revolution and beyond. The influence of the Enlightenment thinking spread beyond Scotland throughout the British Empire and across the European continent. This led the French philosopher Voltaire to claim, "We look to Scotland for all of our ideas of civilization." However, the great Enlightenment thinkers' concern was how to advance humanity, not one nation. They studied and debated economics, philosophy, literature, and the sciences to better civilization, not one country. The Enlightenment was not a uniquely Scottish phenomenon. It involved debate across Europe and the exchange of ideas across borders. These movements, the campaigns for education and care for all, have helped shape who we are today. I am passionate about equality, particularly for women. When I first became active in politics, not many women became politicians. One of the few was the Labour Cabinet Minister, Barbara Castle. But Castle was not alone in fighting for the cause of equal rights between men and women. It was a cause led by women, including countless unrecognised working-class women across the United Kingdom. The Equal Pay Act of 1970, which was introduced by Castle and outlawed discrimination on pay and conditions between men and women, began life not in the House of Commons, but in an industrial dispute in Dagenham in Essex. In 1968, 187 car-seat female machinists at the Ford plant in Dagenham took industrial action to get their work recognised as skilled and equal to their male colleagues. This created the momentum that led to a legal obligation to pay both men and women the same was set in train. These brave women in Essex were not solely motivated about women's rights in Essex. They were motivated by securing equal rights for all women across Britain, Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And in our last period, we have seen a redefining of the political debate, led by these brave women, led by those who talk about low pay, led by women who talked about violence against women. Only a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated in Glasgow 40 years of Women's Aid, an organisation not set up by politicians, not set up by government, but by women who saw a need to protect and support violent women and offer them succour. And now we have, as government policy, funding for those organisations, the virtuous circle of people who understand the need for change, being allied with government, understanding the need to fund them. This is a progressive movement. It was about breaking down barriers, not to trying to find them where they don't exist. So why am I recounting all of this, and what does it have to do with the referendum? Throughout history, we have seen great change. Brave men and women arguing for what they believe in, taking on vested interests, and delivering fairness and equality for the better of us all. But they show us that change is not inevitable. It is not a given. It has to be argued for, fought for. People need to be convinced or persuaded there is a better way, often over time. Not one step on the road to greater equality was ever secured without struggle, whether for universal suffrage or equal access to law or dignity and safety at work. A few weeks ago, we said farewell to Nelson Mandela, a man who devoted his life to changing the world for the better. As a young woman, I marched and campaigned against apartheid because I railed against the injustice it represented. And we believed that it was unfair and that we could change it. But back then, as we stood outside the South African embassy in Nelson Mandela Place, we believed that that establishment that imposed division in South Africa looked indestructible. There was nothing inevitable about change in South Africa. It was not a given that the man who was languishing in prison, who was to us but a face in a T-shirt, would one day walk free and go on to lead his country. Nelson Mandela walking free from Robben Island was such a fantastic moment because we feared it might never happen. And as he stood in the sunshine, tall and straight, it was amazing that he had not been broken by the regime that feared him so greatly. And it is even more amazing, his legacy since then. The fact that he avoided his country descending into bloodbath and revenge through his courage in arguing for truth and reconciliation. And truth and reconciliation itself were not inevitable. He had to win that argument inside his movement amongst those who were the greatest victims of apartheid. So what change do we want for Scotland, and how do we make it happen? My vision for Scotland remains the one I longed for as a young woman when I first joined the Labour Party. I want a Scotland where our brightest and best are armed with the skills and knowledge through our education system to compete on the world stage, driving and sustaining our economy, but also one where all of our children and young people are given the opportunity to realise their potential. I haven't taught in a classroom for 15 years, but I know from my own children I know from my constituents that many of our children still don't get what they should from their time in school, that too many of them are denied the opportunity within the education system, and their needs they bring with them from their homes into the classroom means that they're not properly supported. But I do believe that education holds the key to a better Scotland and a better way of life for the people who live here. And I believe we can start using education to change lives now, not after the referendum. I want a Scotland where our sick, our vulnerable and our elderly are given the dignity and respect they deserve, and that our young people are helped to make the right choices for their own health. We know many of their parents and grandparents have made the wrong health choices, and that Scotland earned itself the unenviable tag of the sick man of Europe. And that is increasing the pressures in our hospitals and in our older people's homes, impacting on the care we can give today. And I believe we can start tackling health inequalities and improving care for our elderly and vulnerable now, not after the referendum. I want a Scotland where we have a thriving, competitive economy that works for everyone, gives opportunity and security to every family. But we know that our economy often works for the few and not the many. I believe we can create a new economy with opportunity and security for all at its heart, and we can do it now. So my ambition is for a Scotland where everyone gets the teaching, the care and the opportunities they deserve, and I'm prepared to realise that one step at a time. That's my vision for Scotland. That is Labour's ambition for the people we represent. But that would still be my vision, even if Scotland votes yes on September the 18th. The Constitution won't change that. I do believe, though, that the economic security and certainty that we get as part of the Union, the ability to pool resources, to spread risk and share reward, give us the best chance of realising that vision. I do believe that by being part of something bigger allows us more influence, more financial power, and more scope to invest and nurture the things we care about. I believe in something called redistribution. I believe wealth should be redistributed to where it is needed. I think that one of the best ways we do this is through the United Kingdom. Let me be clear. I think the United Kingdom is not just made up of Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. I believe that we live in a union of 5, Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland and the remarkable international city-state of London. The UK is the machinery by which we redistribute wealth amongst those 5 constituent parts, and we all benefit. I don't believe we should give that up lightly, since it represents in essence the sense of community we regard as a Scottish value. Rich helps poor in circumstances which can shift. Currently, I would argue that the UK is more about redistribution than the current Scottish state. I cannot think of one policy of the Scottish Government which redistributes wealth from rich to poor. Scotland pays in £56.9 billion to the United Kingdom in tax, yet gets £64.5 billion back in public spending. That's a fact nationalists try to soundbite away. But I cannot think of anything the current Scottish Government does which redistributes wealth from rich to poor. Indeed, I think it is the reverse. If the case for independence requires nationalists to steal the clothes of the progressives, then I have to say it's not your size. They are not delivering on their claim. Redistribution of wealth is a big idea in Scotland, but how much bigger an idea is it when you apply it to the whole of the United Kingdom? I believe the Union allows us the best opportunity to bring about change. I believe the Union emboldens us, not holds us back. It didn't hold us back when we brought the Scottish Enlightenment to the world. It didn't hold us back when we set up the NHS. Scotland has been the scene of great social change as part of the United Kingdom, and it will do so again. But we will have to fight for it. Change for the better won't come just because we have one constitution or another. Whether we have a border or not, it won't make life better for the people of this country, and the bravery to make hard decisions won't be any easier if power lies in Edinburgh rather than London. Whether Scotland is independent or not, we will still have lots of people who believe that taxes and spending should be cut, others who believe taxes and spending should go up, and hundreds of thousands of people somewhere in the middle with all manner of variations in between. There is no set of common values or political beliefs that stretch from John O'Groats through Scotland that comes crashing to a halt at the borders. In my constituency and throughout Scotland, we are no more left-wing or right-wing than our neighbours in Newcastle, Liverpool or Manchester, despite some people's best efforts to portray us as different. If we voted yes on September the 18th, it might mean we get rid of a few Tories. We will still have Conservatives right here at home, the small C Conservatives who put a brake on other people's radical vision for change and whose voices can often be heard louder than those who have none. I remind people over the debate over the minimum wage in 1998. Businesses warned it would cost jobs. Opposition parties fought to oppose it, and some leading politicians couldn't even be bothered staying up for the vote. It was a fierce debate, and there was nothing inevitable about it. Indeed, I remind people that trade unions were at one time against a national minimum wage, believing that free collective bargaining was the only option. But low-paid workers, large numbers of them women, saw the reinforcing of inequality in the workplace as a consequence of this kind of bargaining, and they demanded and fought for change. And it wasn't easy taking on the vested interest, not just of business, but within trade unions too. But those who believed it was the right thing to do resisted the doomsayers and brought about a transformation to people's lives. Nearly 2 decades on, no one disputes the value of the minimum wage. Even George Osborne and Alex Salmond have been converted to its merits. Just like the fight for a national health service more than 60 years ago, the minimum wage and what it represents in addressing inequality in the workplace should remind us how difficult it can be to bring about real change, how difficult it is to resist those with a vested interest or a loud voice. But if we believe in its right, then resist it we should. I can see how the idea that by changing the Constitution we can change Scotland can be pretty seductive, but we cannot afford to be fooled. The notion that we Scots will unite behind a bold and progressive vision once we have thrown off the shackles placed on us by our neighbours is one I simply don't believe. There's a plurality of views across Scotland, just like there is in England and everywhere in the world. We cannot get everyone in Scotland to unite in one fell swoop, but we can build a consensus and a majority over time. And we can build a consensus and a majority right across the United Kingdom. So where do we start? Only by understanding what causes inequality and lack of opportunity will we be able to challenge it. By falsely claiming it is our neighbours south of the border that causes it, we breed complacency about how we can deliver that change. And that is my frustration, that the real debate we should be having about how we change Scotland has been stymied by a false one about the Constitution. And those voices who believe in a better Scotland are being divided into another debate about yes or no. Well, I say this, inequality wasn't created by taking away a border at Gretna, and it won't disappear by putting one back. Only by making an argument, building support, taking a few forward steps at a time and showing patience will we achieve real and meaningful change that will realise our ambitions for our country. Those who think we can fast forward through this process by simply cutting ourselves off from those they see as different simply don't understand our history. And it does make us complacent in our pursuit for change, colluding with a dangerous view that we are different, that we are other, and that there are other people on this island who wish to do us down. And while we're engaged in a debate about the Constitution, we can never really have a proper debate about achieving change, because it suits some to close down that debate in favour of a false one about borders and identity. I ask those people who want radical change on both sides of the referendum debate, when are we going to have a real conversation about how we change people's lives for the better? When are we going to face up to the fact that real change comes about by facing up to hard decisions, by making fairness and equality rather than populism and electoral success top of our priority list? We will not achieve change by promising everyone everything, by squaring off one group and shouting down another, like we see now. But we can do so by having the belief in our argument and being prepared to make it. All of my political life, I have seen the need to build consensus, not create false division where that can be done and we can create opportunity. But it is also true that sometimes it's simply impossible to build a consensus. You have to say this is right or wrong, and if you don't agree with me, I shall take you on. We will not change Scotland by telling one lot of people they can have lower taxes and another lot of people they can have more welfare. That is simply dishonest. And we cannot bring about change by highlighting what we can't do and not what we can do. We will not change Scotland by trumpeting what we put in and ignoring the evidence of outcomes. If a fairer, better Scotland is what we aspire to, then we must be prepared to follow the evidence and prepared to make a political argument, not hide from it. When Keir Hardie founded my party, he didn't start with a focus group. He started by looking at the lived experience of the people whose lives he wanted to improve. When you think about it, it was quite a thing, starting a political party from scratch. His job was to persuade working people that his politics could improve their lives. Persuade, not pander, but also allow his politics to be shaped by their experiences and view of the world. I fear too many in the now political class see their job as to pander, not to persuade. What then happens is that you do not look at the country as a whole, but instead look at it as a series of cohorts to be brought on board. It was the kind of thing which Margaret Thatcher did very successfully, dividing the country against itself, winning enough support to win power. In the short term, it did her and her party well with 3 election victories. But in the long term, we are still paying for that attempt, not to govern the whole country, but just win the support of enough part of it to govern. I believe this current Scottish Government have taken a very similar approach, winning short-term electoral success, which Scotland will pay for later. In Australia, voting is compulsory. If you don't vote, you can get fined $20. Here, voting isn't compulsory, but if you are poor and you don't vote, the Scottish Government can take £1 billion out of the programmes intended to take you out of poverty. If the goal of ending poverty doesn't move you out of a sense of social justice, out of compassion, then let me tell you this, poverty costs. If it doesn't bother you that a child can have their life chances snuffed out by the time they're 3, then let me tell you what you're missing out on. The chance for that child to grow into an adult who contributes to their community, to society, and if you need to hear this, pay taxes. Ending poverty means you release the talents of hundreds of thousands of Scots to contribute to society and not be a drain on our country. I believe the Scottish Government's shift away from the focus on fighting poverty is one which will cost our whole country in the years to come. Those programmes changed lives. They improved the whole country, but they didn't come with easy slogans or sound bites. You couldn't easily tell a voter how much pence would be put in their pockets by funding credit unions or supporting mums back into work. People in poverty and we as a nation were better off with that being addressed. But I believe that we live in a country which has in place of a social policy an electoral strategy, short-term, lacking in vision, but successful for the few, if not the many. And that has to change. That's how I express my patriotism, not with a flag or a plaid or a folk song, you'd be relieved to know, but with a commitment that the next Scottish Labour government will focus on the eradication of poverty in this country. We will dedicate ourselves to make the best use of our greatest resource, our people. And that means we must build a society where all are prized and all have the opportunity to make the best of themselves. What we cannot be is what we are now, what we are increasingly becoming, a country where people's lives are predetermined by the circumstances they were born into. To do it, that means we have to appeal to all of Scotland, be part of that mission, and not divide Scot against Scot, asking the question not, how do we improve our Scotland, but what do I get out of this government? When I joined the Labour Party when I was 17, I was optimistic that we could achieve the kind of Scotland I believed in. Since then, I've gone from being a teenager to a mother, a student, and a politician via teaching, but I'm still an optimist. I've seen too much change and too much progress in my lifetime to give up on this. We may not like some of the decisions made by the current UK government, just like we may not like some of the decisions made by the Scottish government. The answer is to change the government, not the constitution. I'm not ready to give up on Scotland and devolution. I'm not ready to write off England and Wales and Northern Ireland and that partnership that has worked for 300 years, dismissing all of those radical voices across the United Kingdom as if they were all Middle England. I know there are radical and progressive people right across the United Kingdom, and I know that their minds need to be changed and people to be persuaded here in Scotland. I am optimistic that we can make this union work better, that we can make the Scottish Parliament stronger, that we can use the union and devolution to make change for the better and achieve our goals. For we must always remember one very simple thing. Politics is about people, and it's too important to be left to politicians. Politics change the lives of crofters, of women, of the low-paid, of the black majority in South Africa, and it can change Scotland. It won't be easy. It never has been, but it has happened before, and I know and I'm sure it will happen again. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Johann, for that very thoughtful and thought-provoking speech. And I'm sure you can tell your family when you get home that, yes, 130 people did listen to every word that you said. 2 microphones have appeared, as if by magic, so we're now at the question-answer stage. And I'd be very grateful if you could do 3 things for me when you have the microphone. One is to talk into it, because the acoustics work so much better if you do. The second is to announce your name and, if you wish, any designation. And the third is to be concise in your question rather than lengthy comments. So if you could now indicate who would like to kick us off. Then there's a gentleman here, and there's a gentleman here. So let's take those 2 to start us going. We'll take 2 at a time to start with, if that's all right with you. And I reserve the right to interfere when I wish to.
Duncan Clark. Johann, when you were dealing with the referendum for the Scottish Parliament, I assume you probably voted yes, if you didn't tell me. And assuming you voted yes, what was your actual long vision for it?
Thank you. And the second question?
Joshua McCormick from the Scottish Youth Parliament. Following a yes or no vote, would your party commit to enfranchising 16 and 17-year-olds in all future Scottish Parliament, local authority, community council elections and referendums held in Scotland?
Right. 2 nice, concise questions to kick off.
And, of course, concise answers, and you can tell me to shut up if I'm going on for too long. On the question of how I voted, it might be instructive to tell you that in the referendum in 1979, I voted no, because I believed precisely, the argument I was putting forward there, that actually why divide progressive people across the whole of the United Kingdom. I was very anxious about that, and it's actually quite a common position taken by people on the left. By the time we came to 98, I voted yes. And if I can tell you why, I was a school teacher in Springburn throughout that period, throughout the Thatcher period, and I watched what Margaret Thatcher was able to do to the children I was teaching. I didn't think she came after them because they were Scottish. I knew that there were teachers like me standing in classrooms right across the United Kingdom watching the hope draining from children's eyes in front of them and saying, what's the point, miss, because I can't get work? Looking out onto housing that was terrible, a railway industry that had collapsed. And what I learned from that was it isn't about nationhood, but sometimes if decisions are made and you don't have to look in the eyes of the people who live with the consequence of your decisions, it's very hard, it's very easy to be tough and cruel. And I do think Margaret Thatcher was cruel in her economic prescription for the United Kingdom, but she never had to look a family in the eye and address them. And from that, I believed that power needed to come closer. So when I was voting in 1998, it was the idea that you could reach power. It doesn't mean that all power has to be there. I think there's a very strong argument for certain powers to remain at United Kingdom level, some to stay at the Scottish level, and power going down into our communities where people really can influence and shape things. And that was my absolute belief that that was why I was voting the way I did in 98. I regret very much that in the last period we have seen a sucking up of power from our communities into Edinburgh, particularly since 2007. I think there are longer-term consequences of that. I'm a great advocate of the cooperative movement and the housing movement. Just one wee example, that in Glasgow, in my constituency, in a place called Darnley, people were desperate to get out of Darnley because of the nature and the condition of the housing. And a group of women got together and said, we've had enough of this. We've had enough of this. And the local council, and actually at the time I think a Tory government, provided funding to set up housing associations and housing cooperatives. And because they lived in the communities, because they knew families need big kitchens, and they need, safe places for children to learn. They have transformed a community into one in which people are now queuing up to get in. So that is really what drives me politically, and I think it's what I hoped the Scottish Parliament could do. I regret that we have not actually got to the stage where we've learned how to take that power that bit closer. And on the question of enfranchising 16 to 17-year-olds, I think you have to decide where the vote is. I reckon I've got a son who's 16 and he will have a vote in the referendum. I think we've always got an ambivalence about this on the left and the right about how much young people are growing up. We don't want them to go into the army. We don't want them to smoke. But on the other hand, we do want them to vote. And I just think we have to have an honest discussion about where that balance lies. Our party will take a position on it ahead of 2016. I think I'm minded to think that actually it makes sense, because I do think that young people now know more about the world. They're more streetwise at 16 than I was at probably 36, but that's maybe something about my upbringing. But I think that people are being persuaded by it. I think the problem in the referendum, people thought it was a cynical view about it. And I suppose the last point I would make, which I find very interesting, is I think our young people, because of the difference between, I didn't have a phone in my house when I was my son's age, never mind one in my bag, but that way in which they can communicate with the world, the way they can communicate with a community of interest right across the world. Actually, I think they find a lot of this debate around the referendum entirely archaic. They don't really understand national boundaries, never mind nationalism. So my qualified answer to you is we will decide before 2016, but I do think logically and rationally, having got to that point with the referendum, there's a very strong argument for young people who I think are older and wiser than I was at their age having the vote and understanding why it matters.
Right. I may come back to you, if I may, in a moment on the longer-term vision and what further devolution you would be supportive of. But let's ask for two more questions now. There's a gentleman here and there's a gentleman there, so if we can take that one, and if we could bring this microphone round to another Youth Parliament representative? Then we've done the Youth Parliament for a moment after. The gentleman at the back first.
My name's John Elliott. The No campaign in the referendum has to sell a positive message for post-referendum UK if there is a no vote. Do you think that positive image could be a federal structure for the UK? And as a second question, if I may, Chairman, if there is a no vote, do you think that the SNP will allow this matter to drop and allow us to get on with everyday pleasures such as sneering at the English because they lose 5-0 in the Ashes series?
Thank you, John.
Hi, Gary Patterson from the Scottish Youth Parliament as well. I thought it was really good to hear you talk about a lot about education tonight, and Nye Bevan, who's one of my political inspirations. You've talked quite a lot about higher education funding recently, and I wonder if you can give us some details around what you think can be done to protect access to education and creating a fair and equal education system under either independence or within the UK. Thanks.
Thank you. Nice range of questions there.
On the question of there potentially being a federal structure, I think it's quite difficult to envisage that because of the disproportionate size of particularly England in relation to the other bits of the Union. And I think we should probably, it doesn't fit into that kind of box. I think we have to find a way of managing the relationships in a slightly different way. I mean, if we make the case that there is a problem, if we make our greatest trading partner, i.e. England, our economic competitor, there would be an element of that, I think, within any federal structure, and I think I would find that difficult. But of course, the Devolution Commission, which I established, is working its way through these things, and what I'm very keen is that that's an evidence-based argument, that we say we think this would work because, this wouldn't work because, whatever. And I may probably say something more about the Devolution Commission in a moment, but I would take a lot of persuading, I think, that you could manage that very uneven process of a federal structure. And the second question about whether the SNP would let it drop, well, Alex Salmond hasn't let it drop for 40 years, through high days and holidays. I mean, we've had an economic revolution, we've had a social technological revolution in the last 40 years, and the SNP are still arguing for the same solution to scale of the problems that we face. And I think when you think of it in those terms, the way in which the independence argument is prosecuted in circumstances entirely different from when their own party was established. I tried to say in my speech, I'm not sure how clear this was, but the way in which I think Labour movement over time has understood that inequality is expressed in a whole range of ways rather than just an economic one and just round in relation to the workplace. I think nationalism has just simply, it's the same answer regardless of what the scale of the challenge is. And so I'm not optimistic that it will be dropped. I hope that, however, the decision in September is conclusive and that there's not an attempt post the result being announced that somebody steps into that space and redefines for everybody what the people of Scotland were saying. And I think if there is a decisive no vote, that is that we want to embrace it as a positive argument, we want to embrace the United Kingdom. I think the SNP will have to accept that. There is, however, you can understand, a challenge because they will continue in power for 2 years and will use the opportunities of the state to reinvent themselves, to redefine themselves. But that would be for them to say. I do hope that we don't have a never-ending, and I just think we need certainty post September the 18th. On the question of education, as someone who was one of the fortunate people in my class at school to get to go to university, I know the price of that was paid for by all of the people who were not allowed to go to university, who were not able to go to. So yes, I got a grant, but actually that was funded by making sure that access to university education was very limited. And I think we really need an honest, and I was trying to say this, a really honest discussion about education and stop redefining the whole issue of education as one policy around tuition fees or supporting children in our schools through one policy, which is free school meals. The fact of the matter is, I think this last week or so, the statistics come out, increased participation in higher education, 1%, decrease in participation in the further education sector, 37%. That there are no places in further education for women who can only work part-time, go to college part-time because of their childcare responsibilities. And I want people to talk about both bits. If you say that's a price worth paying, that is fine, but be honest about both sides of the equation. Because while we have tuition fees being funded, and that in itself is a good thing, nobody's going to argue it's a bad thing, at the same time, we have the poorest access rates in the whole of the United Kingdom, the highest dropout rates in the whole of the United Kingdom, and shamefully, the worst support for poor students in the whole of the United Kingdom, because that has been the price of that other bit of the policy. I'm not disputing that might be the best policy, but we need to understand the other side of it. And what I want to talk about is actually what you need to do at an earlier stage, because the frustration for me when I was still teaching were children who basically stopped attending school by the end of first, second year. They weren't there was nobody reaching, and now we will not have people like me to reach into these families to bring these children into school, to understand that if your father's violent, it's actually quite difficult sometimes to sit in class and read a poem. And it's these wee bits of glue inside the education system that we're now losing. So we should cede to no one our belief in education and our commitment to it. But what I said in my own speech about settling for the slogan isn't enough. I really think that across anybody who's committed to education in Scotland should stop allowing themselves being defined as a stakeholder who simply says, well, that's all right, my bit's okay. I'm getting funding there. I just think that we need to open up that debate in a far more honest way.
Can I just take you back on the higher education front now, just briefly, which is, you made this comment, you don't know one policy of the Scottish Government which redistributes wealth from rich to poor. Now, one problem with the present higher education funding structure that some people see is that it's regressive in effect rather than progressive, and that the beneficiaries are not those who would be seen as, it doesn't redistribute wealth from rich to poor. It does the reverse, that the gains are those who participate. Does that cause you concern? I know you've spoken about this in the past.
It causes me concern, and my greater frustration is badged as a policy to address poverty. Now, I actually think there is an issue for middle-income families to fund tuition, and people might be inhibited from going into university, and that would be a grave concern. That's a dilemma for anybody who believes that we need to fulfil the potential of all our children. But disproportionately, people who do well in their first set of hires will benefit from free tuition. Yeah. Those who need to go to college to get the qualifications to get them to university, either because there was episodes in their lives that didn't allow them to engage fully at secondary school stage, or because they went to work first and discovered the joy of learning later, second stage learning. All of that has been stripped out of the system. And all I ask for is, in those circumstances, that we, human and empiricist, maybe we should look at the evidence, maybe we should see actually what's happening. And the difficulty, I think, has been, and all parties have been guilty of this, we almost infantilise the electorate. We stop saying, as great labour movement ideas in the past, where they came out of communities and said, politicians, you need to deal with this. We say, you're in the third sector, tell us your ask. You're in business, you tell us your ask. You're in higher education, you tell us your ask. And then the manifesto will come out with a series of offers, and everybody can be really pleased because their wee offer is there. But actually, underneath that, where you then settle for that argument, you don't then look at actually the consequence of it. And I personally think this is not a debate that politicians can win. It is rationalists, it is people who are thinking, it is people who care about evidence-led policy, who will have to force that onto the agenda, because otherwise, in that battle, so you don't believe in free education, you need somebody who's rooted in education, who is an educationalist, to say it's not free education if it disproportionately benefits those who've actually benefited from a settled life that allows them to secure a good education at an earlier stage.
Okay, there's a lady here. No, we're not coming back to the lady here first, and then is there anyone on this side? There's a hand up there, and then we'll go to those. There's a hand there. We'll go to those hands back there afterwards. Yes.
Elizabeth Meehan. I wonder if you could say something about the great uncertainty over the future UK to which we might still belong, and especially as you hope for a really decisive no vote to the Scottish referendum. And that is, will the United Kingdom be in the European Union? And what would be the future of the debate about Scotland if, as it seems likely, a vote to come out of the European Union would be more likely to be carried by a majority of votes in England than at least in Scotland, perhaps not Northern Ireland.
Okay, and there's
yes. Fiona McNeill from the Young Academy of Scotland. You said you look forward to the possibility of maybe one day leading a Scottish Labour government and trying to do something about the inequality and the poverty in Scotland. Don't you think you'd be in a stronger position to do that as a leader of an independent country with the ability to develop your own welfare policy and raise taxes and so forth, than as a leader of a government with very limited powers under a Westminster government that's likely to be quite far to the right of the Scottish Labour Party?
And if I can add a rider to that, doesn't that then mean that you should be seeking devolution of welfare in the event of a no vote? So, over to you.
Just a wee easy rider to
Yes,
put in.
I'm trying to be helpful at all times.
Oh, well, that sounds like as helpful as my children tend to be to me as well. I think the European question is a really interesting one, and as somebody who comes from the left of my own party, historically there was a lot of hostility to the European Union, and it divided our own party for many years. It's much more marked now in the Conservative Party, I think. Some of the debate, I think, about Europe is a proxy for another debate, which is about to what extent do we think that our Britain, our Scotland, our England is what we remember it to be, and there's some very conservative views in that. I actually think we need to embrace and be positive about Europe. We need to talk about the social union and what that has meant in terms of rights, in terms of health and safety and so on. But we also have to recognise it's like the argument about why do we want the Scottish Parliament. There's a feeling of distance. It's very far away from us. I don't think it's particularly helped by the way in which we elect our MEPs, most of whom do a fantastic job, but it's very difficult for them to be rooted anywhere. So I think we should be honest about the importance of Europe economically and socially and be confident in making that argument. I think the dilemma you present is what would happen if Scotland wanted to stay in the European Union and the rest of the United Kingdom didn't. To be honest with you, my sense is that hostility towards Europe is extreme in the Conservative Party, but there's a latent hostility probably in all certain parts of the United Kingdom. And I think it's probably the bigger challenge is for all of us to make that. I know some people prosecute that as a case for Scotland being independent because we're more likely to be in Europe, but I think the consequences of that would be massive. I just think we should probably, and none of us is very good at doing this, is be positive and strong about why the European Union matters, why a Europe that was ripped apart by war in the past, that message of people coming together and working together is not, we should be celebrating it more than we are doing, but there are interesting conundrums there that start making your head explode when you think what might happen if we went independent or whatever. And we're not even going to go to the place where we know that Alex Salmond knows better the rules of the European Union than the Prime Minister of Spain. On the question of inequality and would it not be better to drive that, you know, to have the powers to make a difference in Scotland rather than the United Kingdom? I think my first view on this is, my first position in this is actually there is nothing inevitable about an independent Scotland having a more progressive agenda. You still have to make the political argument. You'd have to win the political argument to say you want to spend money on welfare and protecting people who are not in work. And indeed, the social attitudes survey that came out this week tells us there's not actually that much of a difference. And in fact, there's a hardening of attitudes towards people who find themselves in vulnerable positions, both in Scotland and across the United Kingdom. And that's why I almost feel that the constitutional debate is, it takes us away from winning that argument, because it says, oh, we would do that. We would do that in Scotland. Well, we wouldn't. We would only do it if we win the political argument. And I actually think we are able to support the weak and the vulnerable better by redistributing resources across the whole of the United Kingdom. But I do think you still then have that equation, which is the point that you're referring to. What power absolutely needs to lie at a UK level on the economic, you know, all the surveys will tell you that people want pensions to remain at a UK level. They want that idea of being able across the whole of the country have the same social security and the same kind of protection. That's a very attractive view. There are things that you can take down to the Scottish Parliament in terms of a strategy around employability, supporting vulnerable people and so on, and there's stuff they can take down to local government. There are some issues, though, that although people say we don't want all welfare to be devolved, or many people would argue that case, there are actually bits of it that would make sense, and that one of the things that we're exploring just now is how do you make some of that make sense. Now, for a very simple example, housing benefit and access to housing benefit can very often be an inhibitor to people going into work. We also know that housing benefit can be, and has been in my constituency elsewhere, exploited by rogue landlords who trap people in poverty, who are then not able, because of circumstances, to find themselves to even access the work that's available. So if it was possible to, you know, keep policy and welfare at a UK level, but there are some practical things that you can devolve, that makes sense. And if you're following the evidence, that makes sense and explains why some welfare responsibilities have actually already been devolved. But I suppose my main point to you is that I still, no matter what the constitutional arrangement is, you have to win the argument about investing in welfare, investing in equality. And I think you can prosecute that case as easily at a UK level as you can at a Scottish level, because I do get frustrated by the way in which many people actually write off whole nations, a whole group of countries as, well, they are all inevitably more right-wing than us and we've been held back by them. It's simply, first of all, it's not true, but secondly, it's kind of the antithesis of solidarity and creating equality anyway, if you simply say we will divide ourselves off from that in the way that some suggest.
Thank you. And you're playing our tune by talking about evidence-based policy making. Thank you. There's a lady and a gentleman next to each other there, so if we can take the lady first.
Charlotte Barber, I would like to ask you if you think there's sufficient and active membership of political parties, and if not, how you might increase it, particularly beyond, say, just an independence question, and more actively to make a better Scotland, better Britain.
Fine, if you could then pass the microphone to your left.
My name is Ian Doig. I would like to get a better understanding of what the implications of a no vote would be. My problem is I don't favour either of the two issues that are going to be on the ballot paper. I don't favour independence, but I certainly don't favour the status quo. So I think you said at the end of your talk you wanted to make the union work better. So my question is, if in the event of a no vote, what would you and your party offer by way of increased devolution, which I think is what a lot of people would like?
Okay. On the first question, Charlotte, about political parties, I suspect the idea of mass movement political parties was always honoured in the breach. That, you know, my own party may have aspired to that, but there were all sorts of reasons why people were excluded and didn't feel they were involved. And indeed, one of my deep and abiding passions inside the Labour Party has been to open up the Labour Party. We have done it through fighting around women's representation to make politics to look more like people's lives and to make the policies we're talking about more relevant. I just think that, you know, political parties have a responsibility to be talking about what's happening in the real world, and one of the ways you can do that is by having a membership that reflects that, and that is always a challenge and a battle, because not everybody wants to spend their lives in boring meetings in really horrible halls in a weekend, which too many of us as political people get involved in politics do. So I think it's a huge challenge, and my sense is, I mean, as a youngster, I didn't go join the Labour Party until I went to university, although I came from a family that supported the Labour Party. Now, that tells you something. It tells you that the Labour Party wasn't good at reaching out to its own support and encouraging them to be involved, was perhaps a little kind of patronising, that they could do the work for you. And I just think that some of the powerful changes inside my own movement have been where people have aged actively in politics. So I think there needs to be a way in which we open political parties up. We need to stop this kind of idea that everything about politics is bad and everybody's at it and they're all corrupt and all the rest of it. There is a joy in politics when you look at what Mandela was able to do. There's a joy in politics when you look at what the women's movement was able to do to address domestic abuse. And we also, I think, need to bring together all the energy that people, particularly young people, have around arguing about the environment, talking about equality. If you look at I only have to look at my own inbox to look at the number of people who care deeply about equal marriage, who are really engaged about it, who really feel that it matters. So people are political, they cared about the same thing as I did when I was young. They just don't see what political parties are about. They see political parties as a vehicle for political careers. And I think that is a problem, and some of it is a mindset. For me, it took me about 10 years actually to call myself a politician after I got elected, because I ended up by happenstance as an accident as an MSP. I didn't join the Labour Party to become an elected politician. I joined the Labour Party because I really believed about things. And I think we need to get back to a bit of that and celebrate that voluntarism that's in political parties, that politics is not, can't just be about a profession and a class. It has to be about something richer than that, but also bringing together people who are very political about all sorts of things about the world, care deeply about it, and actually say to them, politics is relevant to that. But that happens when you don't have the ask and offer, but you actually have everybody who's in a position to make a difference talking about and relating to those kind of political passions that people have.
Then the little question of what a no vote means.
You know, the frustration, I'll start off with the frustrations of this. My preferred position on the ballot paper would have been two positive statements. I want Scotland to be an independent country. I want Scotland to stay strong in the United Kingdom, because I think these are the genuine offers that are there. And there are some people who want to frame this debate as being between Scotland and the Tories. I'm more than happy to fight with the Tories. I've done it all my political life. But my problem with David Cameron is that he's a Tory, and it's not about his identity. So I think that the difficulties with some of this debate is there's a false debate that the inevitable conclusion of not liking the Tories is that we must therefore embrace constitutional change. So that's my first frustration, that we immediately are trying to prove a negative. We're having to encourage people to say no, when I actually think there's a very positive, strong case for redistribution across the United Kingdom, taking the wealth out of the South East and spreading out to where need is. And I would celebrate that. I think that makes sense. And there are therefore those who, in prosecuting change, and change is about moving out of the United Kingdom, want the alternative to be the status quo. But actually the parties of devolution are those who have resisted the status quo over many years. It was Labour, the Liberal Democrats, Civic Scotland, the trade unions who came to the churches, who came together in the Constitutional Convention and said, we want to be in the United Kingdom, but we want power to be closer to people. We want to embrace the difference that is Scotland's education system and its justice system, and we believe we can do that inside the United Kingdom. And we're continuing that work. We ought not to allow others to frame for us what our commitment to redistributing power and empowering people is. And therefore, I'm not going to tell you here what the Devolution Commission's findings will be, not least because the Devolution Commission itself might be a little offended that I'm second-guessing the conclusions that they're drawing up as I speak. But I did hint earlier at my approach to this, which is not about two institutions having a fight. It's not Westminster against Holyrood. It is about a rational debate about where you place power to best serve the interests of the people of Scotland. I don't subscribe to the view that I think some would prosecute that there's a wee tartan box somewhere in Whitehall with Scotland's rights in it, and if we jump up and down enough, they'll maybe throw a few at us to keep us quiet for another wee while. I don't subscribe to the view that basically the people, the rest of the United Kingdom, want to steal the eyes out of our heads. I think most people want to work in cooperation. So we will produce a set of rational proposals about where best you place power to achieve the kinds of goals of a strong economy and shared prosperity that we all achieve, but we will also resist the idea, and I think it's very important, that this bizarre notion that if you vote yes, that these people who want to destroy you if you stay in the United Kingdom, they want to do you down, they want to deny you your rights, will somehow, if they become a separate country, become your friends and engage in how we can best cooperate on the currency and all else. So we will produce a package of powers to strengthen devolution. I think there's a particularly strong case around accountability. If you've got a government that has £32 billion to spend and is not really responsible for raising much of it, then you do get that kind of incentive to spend the money where you'll get the best return electorally, as opposed to where you get the best return for the people of this country.
So when will we know that?
In spring.
The spring?
The Devolution Commission is going to report to the Scottish Conference.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's a gentleman here and a gentleman at the front, if we can take those two, and then we'll go. So, let's have a couple of sharp ones. Yes, John.
John Brand. There does seem to be a consensus, even among the Scottish political parties, that more devolution is required. But I don't quite understand why, in the event of a no vote, a Westminster government would find the political energy, or indeed the parliamentary time, to, if you like, pander to what you describe as the interests of the Scottish people.
Okay, thank you.
Joanne, do you think it's morally right for Scottish MPs to vote on domestic English legislation when English MPs can't vote on Scottish domestic legislation?
And would you like to tell us who you are?
I'm a fund manager. A fund manager.
Sorry, you didn't give your name either. That's all. Yes, sorry, I know Angus, but just for the others. Right, so,
okay.
Here on.
I think that the debate on how we secure the union and how we get right the balance of powers is in the interest of everybody across the United Kingdom. I think we want a settled will, don't we? We want a settled will on the constitutional question. And I certainly think that it is important, and people will say how we think we need to address this, so that we don't have the next 20 years having a false argument about what creates inequality and all that stuff, and proving that up is down and in is out, and when the Prime Minister of Spain says something, he didn't really mean it because he's a vested interest, all that kind of just rubbish politics that we have to suffer. I think there's a prize for everyone across the whole of the United Kingdom for our elected representatives to ensure at a UK level that devolution settlement is worked out. And I think it's a matter of faith with people. I mean, I know that people will say, well, why would they? Now that it's settled, why would they? I think it's going to be part of the fabric. It's increasingly a part of the fabric of the debate now, in people drawing conclusions about how they're going to vote, actually how that devolution is going to be strengthened. And I think it is important that they do find the time to do that, because the prize then is you actually have a government at UK level, Scottish level, local government level, focused on the big questions of demographic change, the challenge of public spending, rather than all of that energy, all that cleverness. I don't know if there's any civil servants in here. All these big brains being focused on making the case on one side and the other, rather than saying, how do we make sure that an elderly person who needs care is not being visited for 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes at night? How do we do that? There are people who can find solutions to that, but their brains are not being addressed to these questions now. So I think that is the prize. On the question of whether it's morally right, I think we need to accept that devolution is asymmetrical. that people in England were given the opportunity to devolve beyond the Westminster and chose not to do so. And I think it's simply a matter of reality that if you're elected to a UK Parliament, if you're elected to Westminster, you can't have different gradations of MPs within that. And actually there are very few laws, I suspect, that could entirely be about English domestic policy. I know that there was a committee of the Parliament looked at this, and they proposed a national convention to address this very question about the way of the whole asymmetry of devolution. And I'm not sure what question to which the answer was would be a national convention. But what I said in evidence to the committee was I believe that this was a challenge for England. It's an interesting question for England. It's interesting for areas within England. We speak of England as if it were one place. We speak of London as if it were only millionaires, when we know actually some of the poorest people in the whole United Kingdom live in London. So, there's a huge diversity in England itself. My understanding is that the dialogue and conversation in England is much more about getting local authorities to work together, and maybe there's some interesting work being done by the Tories around sort of creating incentives for cities and regional economies to do things, and that might be their answer. But I think that I think we simply have to accept if you're an MP elected to Westminster, you can't be constrained, in my view, simply by definition of what would be an English law in terms of what you can influence. We can see the challenge of it, but I think largely it's an issue about how the English then address the question of decentralisation.
We're going to take two final questions. One microphone is here, and there's a gentleman with his hand up at the back there, if we can go to him. Sorry to those who haven't got asked. Alan, if you'd like to go first.
Alan Alexander, David Hume Institute and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I'm very struck by the interplay between the two passions in your speech, Johann, i.e. optimism and redistribution. I've been helping to organise a series of seminars for the RSC on enlightening the Constitution. We had one in November on welfare and public services. And with one voice, the 5 experts we had in the panel said that the greatest inhibition to change in the welfare system was the reluctance of politicians to propose any policies which created losers. How do you react to that?
Thank you. Gentleman at the back there.
My name's Kevin Lang. I'm from the Law Society of Scotland. You mentioned the need for politicians to talk about real issues that matter to real people. And I know, Joanne, that you're aware of the research which we published with Ipsos Mori a couple of weeks ago, which showed that big groups of people feel misinformed, don't feel engaged, and actually there was a particular problem with women voters who felt particularly disengaged. I was interested to know why you think that is, and also what you think politicians, not just in your own party, but in other parties collectively, have to do to turn those statistics around.
Okay, on the first question from Alan, I think it's largely learned behaviour. And if just the electorate would stop rewarding people that offer them bribes, it would help. That is the challenge and the dilemma. That is the toughness of it, is that at one level politicians infantilise the electorate and say it's all really easy and we can just do all of this and we just give you all these goodies. But equally, there is no doubt that people like those goodies, and there is a huge challenge in that. And I actually think the only way you can break that down is by talking about the consequence of particular choices. That it's most evident to me. I was very struck by what Alec Bell said, the advisor to Alex Salmond, in his explanation of why he supported Scotland separating from the rest of the United Kingdom. He said he simply believed a smaller state could be more nimble-footed, it could change things, it could be more flexible. I think that is a really interesting argument. But you're never going to get anywhere near that if you pretend that independence is the land of milk and honey, that we can please both those who think the corporation tax should be cut to the bones and that we should have welfare standards the same as the Nordic countries. It's completely ludicrous. But the only way we will be able to break through that, in my view, is first of all, if you begin to talk about, you don't just look at the one side of the moon, you actually say, you do this in higher education, this is what's happening in further education. If you do this in health, this is what's happening in terms of cancer drugs and so on. But I'm honest with you, If I say that it's learned behaviour from politicians, it means that other people who get this and understand it should be speaking out. We had a ridiculous debate in the Parliament last week. There is no money, but we had a debate about whether we'd spend that no money on childcare or on free school meals. And the free school meals case was prosecuted on the basis of it being an anti-poverty measure. Whatever it is not an anti-poverty measure to fund an expansion of free school meals to children who are not poor. It might be actually about social, it could be about a whole lot of things, but it's a false debate if you don't look at the whole of the moon. So my plea is the people who can do that are people who are not elected politicians. The best example I can think of is how you get people in higher education to talk about the consequences of the funding for higher education for their friends in further education, because they all are deeply passionate about education. And I think that, to be honest with you, that is the bit I do my best, but there are limits. You know, if it's not those who are directly suffering the consequences of those false choices are not able to speak out. On the point from the Law Society about people feeling disengaged, and particularly women voters being particularly disengaged. Maybe women are more like David Hume and are sceptics and empiricists. I don't know. I do know that it's deeply insulting to women to say, we seem to have a problem with you. Can we start talking about children? We've never talked about them before, but look, it's the only reason we're in this party. The only reason I joined SNP was because I care deeply about childcare. Nonsense. It is a nonsense, but it is true, I think, for women that it's not enough to dream. You actually have to know that that things will be secure for your families, that it is rational and logical and makes a difference. And that won't be for all women. We know there are women who support independence as well. But I think the bigger problem is that a lot of people are interested in the debate, but the only voices they're hearing currently are those of politicians. And, you know, I'm not being falsely modest about this, but me shouting at Alex Salmond and he shouting back at me is not the best way to educate and invigorate a debate. But actually, I think there are people who are currently silenced in the debate whose voices we need to hear. We need to have people who have got the confidence and the permission to speak, and that is not happening, whether it's because of the kind of the foul behaviour on the internet, or whether it's because people understand how to use the power that they've got. So businesses, people in the voluntary sector and elsewhere, either say, well, it's won, isn't it, so why do we need to speak out? Or say, if we speak out, there is a consequence. Now, I just think that all of us in this process, I think actually on both sides of the debate, would be refreshed and liberated and enriched by people who understand in their walk of life, in their experience, what the constitutional change might mean for them. And that is not happening. And I think there is a big problem. This question is far too big to be left to people who do it for a living, because inevitably people just switch off to that. But I'll tell you, if the accountants say there's a problem with pensions, that makes a much bigger difference. If people who really care about the health service or whatever are saying we're not quite sure if this is the right priority, we should do something else, these are the voices that matter. And actually, I think we need to get back to that in terms of shaping policy too. In the early days of the Labour government in Westminster, and certainly in the Scottish Parliament, I think one of the biggest things we did was to have the confidence to understand that all of the big ideas are not sitting in St Andrew's House or in our Labour Party headquarters. And it's a mark of some of the most progressive things we did, that we drew on the housing movement, we drew on people who understand social policy, we talked to people who are engaged in child poverty, we talked to people who had family members with a learning disability and said, help us shape change. And I think we need to go back to that. We go through the Constitution doing that by hearing those voices. The number of people have said to me, well, I don't want to put my head above the parapet. We can't afford that on either side of the debate. And I suppose my plea is that where people think they have something to contribute, understand how important that voice is, far, far more important than anything that's ever going to be said, either in a chamber or at question time by me shouting at my opposite number in the SNP.
Well, thank you very much. And I would just remind everyone here that this series of seminars is organised by the David Hume Institute with the Young Academy of Scotland from the Royal Society, but also in with the support of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland, the Law Society of Scotland, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and the Institute of Faculty of Actuaries. So all of those 6 organisations tend to adopt a position of quasi-neutrality, but are those who have the evidence and the understanding and the knowledge that may help them to inform the discussion of key issues. And I listened very carefully to what you said about needing to get a broadening of the contributions to the discussion.
Just to say, I think that saying nothing is not being neutral, because it's denying people information that they require.
Well, we're certainly trying to provide the information. That's one of the reasons we're here today. I'm very grateful to all those that have worked with us and to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here this evening. You now have the opportunity to discuss further over a glass of refreshing wine, which is waiting outside for everybody. But I would like you all, please, to join me in thanking most sincerely our speaker tonight for, as I said, a very thoughtful and very thought-provoking talk, and for answering so fully and so frankly the questions that were put to her. So may we thank Johann Lamont.